On September 30th, 1876, the Sydney Morning Herald began an article with the following statement, quote, "It was hardly to be expected that the destructive effects of the terrific gale would be confined to the land. But little was it anticipated that such a heart-rending catastrophe as that which befell the Dandenong, and which sent a thrill of horror through the community, would have been chronicled."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Terrible Storm of the Dandenong.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Dandenong was an iron-hulled screw steamer of 575 tons. She was built in 1867 and was owned by the Melbourne Steamship Company. She had been bought almost immediately after being launched by them and arrived off the coast of Australia in 1868. The Dandenong had a very good reputation as a reliable ship and a good sailor. She traveled a very regular and routine route from Melbourne to Sydney and Newcastle, and then back, carrying both passengers and cargo. She had undergone regular maintenance, and among the changes that had been made to her over the years were steam-powered apparatus on her deck to speed her unloading and loading, as well as updated passenger accommodations to keep her competitive. There was nothing to suggest, as they departed from Melbourne on the afternoon of Friday the 8th of September, that there was to be anything unusual about the voyage. The ship had made 206 trips over her career, with nothing to make anyone comment. And there was no reason for anyone to believe that her 207th voyage would live on in history. On board for her voyage, under the command of Captain J. Irwin, was a crew of 28, 27 saloon passengers, and 28 steerage passengers. There were also 162 sheep on board, in addition to a mixed cargo that was generally agreed to be fairly valuable. The weather seemed good, and the wind was favorable from the north as they traveled down Hobson's Bay. This favorable weather would continue through the day, but Saturday would dawn with a drizzle and a haze. It would soon be found that the drizzle was just a hint of what was to come. By the evening of Saturday, when all of a sudden the wind shifted to blowing strongly from the east. As the wind shifted, it turned into a gale that the Dandenong was now in the middle of. The wind had not stopped shifting yet, though. Slowing, it shifted so that it was coming from the south, and the Dandenong was now fighting against the choppy sea and the strong winds. Through Sunday the storm continued, and the wind ever increasing, and the ship was taking on a lot of water, but there was still nothing to alarm the people on the ship. She seemed to be holding her own in the storm, even though the winds had now reached hurricane force. By midnight going into Monday the 11th, the Dandenong was near Jervis Bay, about 160 miles from Sydney. In Sydney, they were experiencing the same storm that was tossing the Dandenong, and it was reported that from 12:15 to 12:30, the wind was blowing an average at a rate of 112 miles per hour, but with gusts of 2 minutes reaching the force of 153 miles an hour. It was a storm capable of terrible destruction. In Sydney, buildings lost their roofs, chimneys fell down. One of the lampposts on the Piermont Bridge was bent out of shape, and there was even a report that a house had blown over. It was said that the only thing to be thankful for was that few people were out on the street at such an early hour, and therefore injuries were kept at a minimum. That was on shore, though. The people on the Dandenong had nowhere to shelter as the storm hit their ship at full force. At 1 a.m. on Monday the 11th, the engines of the Dandenong came to a sudden halt. Captain Irwin had remained on the deck of the ship since the storm had begun, and now the chief engineer came to find him and tell him that the engines had broken down. Captain Irwin immediately attempted to bring his ship into the wind now that he had lost engine power, but with the force of the storm, no sails were able to last for long, and soon they were in useless tatters. Soon, the Dandenong was rolling in the troughs in the sea and taking on more water. It was found that part of the water that the ship was now shipping was from a gash in her hull. Her engines had stopped when her propeller shaft had snapped from the force being exerted on it, and the shaft had punctured the aft compartment of the ship. The ship was no longer just taking on water from waves breaking over her, but she was also now flooding from the stern hull. The passengers and the crew began to take shifts on the pumps, but they were not able to keep up with the water rushing into the ship. First Mate Lawson led a party to try to stop the leak using the bedding and mattresses from the cabins on the ship, but this did no good. They also started to disconnect the shaft from the engine so that they could use the engine to power the bilges, but the water gained on them so quickly that they were forced to abandon the project. The fires in the engine room were quickly extinguished by the rising water. On seeing this, Captain Irwin gave the order to begin to throw the cargo overboard, hoping that lightening his ship would prolong their fight in the storm. The Dandenong was still settling beneath their feet, though, and even though the ship was well provided with boats, they did not seem as though they would be of much use in seas as rough as what they were still experiencing. There was too high of a chance that they would swamp before they could ever get away from the sinking ship. The Dandenong held out in this condition until 2 p.m., when a ship was spotted on the horizon. The ship, a bark named the Albert William from Wallaroo, with a cargo of copper, spotted the distress signals of the Dandenong and drew close to the troubled vessel. At first, the Albert William attempted to throw a line to the sinking steamer, but each attempt failed, and it was eventually given up. With the Albert William now standing by, though, it now made it worth the risk to use the boats of the Dandenong. While they were not likely to be able to ride out the storm for long, they might be able to reach the other ship. First Mate Lawson decided to take the first boat, and after putting some passengers on the boat as well as some crew members to row, he headed for the Albert William. The first mate's boat almost made it to the Albert William, but as they got close to the sailing vessel, the boat ended up in a trough in the waves and then smashed into the side of the Albert William. The boat immediately swamped, and the first mate, two of the sailors, and a child who was among the passengers were the only people who made it on board of the Albert William. The child was saved by the first mate, but lost her entire family with the loss of the boat. The second boat had better luck. It successfully got its load of passengers on board of the bark and turned back to make a second trip. Unfortunately, the second trip ended in disaster, with that boat also getting smashed against the side of the Albert William and sinking rapidly. From that boatload, only 2 people were able to climb onto the bark. The third boat departed from the Dandenong under the command of the second mate, McEwen. Like the other 2 boats, it was smashed on the side of the Albert William, but this time only 2 people on board that boat were lost, while everyone else made it on board the rescuing ship. When darkness fell, it became impossible for any more people to be brought over from the Dandenong. In total, they now had 39 people from the Dandenong on board of the Albert William, but 17 other people who had attempted the voyage across had been lost in the attempt. The weather was still stormy, and managing small boats in the dangerous conditions in darkness was not something that they were willing to attempt. There were still a couple of boats left on the Dandenong, but if those were to get smashed, as the first 3 boats did, any rescue would become much more complicated. There were still 40 people left on the Dandenong as night fell, but the captain of the Albert William, Captain Walker, assured them that we would be standing by until morning, though Everyone on both ships knew there was a good chance that the sinking ship would not last that long. They were right. Between 8 and 9 o'clock that night, the watch on the Albert William watched as the lights from the Dandenong suddenly disappeared. There was no sound to be heard over the noise of the storm. The Albert William remained at its station through the night, but when daylight broke, there was no longer any sign of the other ship. Captain Walker entertained the vague hope that maybe, during the night, the other ship had somehow managed to limp into the safety of Sydney Heads, but as he got close to Sydney Heads himself, he abandoned the idea. He was just able to flash his ship's number as he passed by due to the continuing terrible weather conditions. This will later be condemned, with people saying that if he had signaled the news of the loss of the Dandenong sooner, help could have arrived at the site of the wreck, and maybe found survivors up to 12 hours sooner. Captain Walker stated that it was entirely impossible to do so. If he had approached nearer the shore, or stopped his vessel due to the conditions around the Sydney Heads at the time, his ship would have been caught in the surf, and his own ship would have been in danger of destruction. The same thought also drove him from the idea that the sinking Dandenong would have been able to make it safely there. But as the Albert William traveled, he kept his ship close to land, hoping to find either the steamer or boats belonging to the Dandenong. There was no sign of either, and Captain Walker brought the survivors of the Dandenong as well as the news of the probable loss of the ship to Newcastle soon after. As soon as the news was known, the government of New South Wales dispatched the government steamer Thetis to the scene of the wreck, as well as telegraphed all the surrounding cities of the news so they could be on the lookout. The naval vessel, HMS Sappho, was also ordered to search the area soon after. Other ships from private companies also joined in the hunt for survivors. There was not only no sign of any survivors, but they were not even able to find any wreckage. The Dandenong had completely disappeared. Public sentiment was initially inclined to blame Captain Walker of the Albert William for not doing enough, especially for not having stopped at the Sydney Heads to spread the news. But the people who had been saved from the Dandenong were quick to his defense. They all stated that Captain Walker had done everything in his power to save the lives of the people on the Dandenong, and that no blame was to be assigned to him, for having passed by the Sydney Heads when to stop would have put his own ship in terrible danger. The plight of the survivors remained. Many of them had lost family members and friends in the loss of the Dandenong. In Newcastle, one of the captains in port, Captain Clark, chartered a steamer named the Cheviot for the transportation of the survivors, while the inspector of police at Newcastle put them up in hotel rooms. Here they ran into bureaucracy, however. The shipping master in Newcastle refused to render assistance to the sailors who had been victims of the shipwreck, as was expected, because he said they were already being cared for on the Cheviot and had no need for assistance. It was not until Captain Clark made this public at a meeting that had been organized to make a fund for the relief of the survivors that public opinion pressured the shipping master to supply the crew with new clothing. With the crew situated, the fund raised £170 to get what was needed for the surviving passengers, with particular attention being paid to the children. When the surviving 17 crew members were sent back to Melbourne on board of the Cheviot, the 3 children were the only passengers who went with them. The other passengers all had friends and family in the Newcastle area to stay with. All 3 of the children were dressed in mourning clothing. One little girl had been part of a family of 8, and was now the only survivor. Another little boy had lost his mother. And the third, a little girl, had lost her stepsister, who she was traveling with. The 3 children who had been left without guardians were cared for by the ship's stewardess until they reached Melbourne, and family and friends were able to come for them. An inquiry into the loss of the Dandenong, and the 57 lives that were lost with her, was held in Melbourne. It was determined in the end that the cause of the disaster was nothing more than the breaking of the propeller shaft, and that there was no blame to be assigned to the actions of the captain or the crew. Captain Irwin had gone down with his ship. The last anyone had seen of him, he was standing on the bridge and showed no sign of moving. Instead of blame, there was a lot of praise to go around. 4 members of the crew of the Dandenong, who had played the most active role in bringing people from the sinking steamer to the Albert Williams, were rewarded with golden watches and purses of money by the government of Victoria. Captain Walker was also rewarded in the same manner, as well as receiving £50 from the merchants of Sydney. In Sydney, there would also be established a permanent shipwreck fund after the outpouring of support for the survivors of the Dandenong. It was stated that with the many shipwrecks that had occurred on their coast, it would be beneficial to be able to immediately help survivors when they came ashore, an idea that was met with great support. The loss of the Dandenong had left her mark in public minds. It would be remembered in song for years to come, and it would also give its name to the storm of 1876. The storm that had claimed her and those on board of her.
For more information, please see the Australian Town and Country Journal from the 23rd of September, 1876, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.